Someone you love is gone. The body is still warm. The fire is still burning. And everyone in the camp knows, because in a group of 20 or 30 people, there is nowhere to hide from death. For roughly 300,000 years, this was the only kind of grief that existed. No funeral home, no death certificate, no professionally managed distance between you and the fact that a person you depended on was no longer there. And what your ancestors did next would shock most people alive today. Death, for most of human history, was not hidden. It was not handed off. It was not sanitized. It was handled by the people who loved the person most, with their bare hands, in the dirt, in the dark, with everything they had. Here is what that actually looked like. Your ancestor's name for this story is irrelevant. What matters is her role. She was a healer, a grandmother, the person in the band who remembered where the water was during the last drought, who knew which roots caused fevers, which leaves stopped bleeding. When she died, probably in her 40s, which was genuinely old for this era, the loss was not just emotional, it was strategic. It was dangerous. Anthropologist James Sussman, who spent decades living with the Juhovenzi people of the Kalahari, one of the last populations still practicing a lifestyle close to our prehistoric ancestors, documented something remarkable. When someone died in the band, the group did not move on quickly. They stayed. They processed. And the processing was communal, physical, and loud. Grief in the ancient world was not quiet. In modern Western cultures, grief tends to be private. You are given a few days. You are expected to compose yourself. There is an unspoken social pressure to return to normal as quickly as possible. Psychologist Paul Rosenblatt, who analyzed mourning practices across 78 different cultures, found that this model, private, restrained, time-limited grief, is actually the global outlier. In the vast majority of human cultures, grief is public, extended, and bodily. People wail, they tear at their hair, they collapse into each other, they make noise that carries across the landscape. This is not cultural. Neuroscientist Mary Frances O'Connor, who studies the grieving brain, has shown that acute grief activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Your brain does not distinguish at a cellular level between a broken bone and a broken attachment. The wailing your ancestors performed was not theatrical. It was the sound of a nervous system processing genuine damage. So the first thing your ancestors did when someone died was feel it, loudly, together, without apology. Then they prepared the body. In most hunter-gatherer societies, this was done by family, by people who had touched this person their entire lives. The body was washed, sometimes with water, sometimes with plant materials that smelled clean or carried symbolic meaning. In some cultures, red ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide pigment ground into a red powder, was applied to the skin. Archaeological evidence of this practice goes back at least 100,000 years, found at sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa. The red color was deliberate. Ochre was used in ritual contexts throughout the Paleolithic. Red, the color of blood, of life, of fire. Applying it to the dead may have been a way of symbolically insisting that something of the living remained. This is not primitive superstition. This is meaning-making under the most extreme condition a mind can face. The question of what to do with the body afterward varied dramatically by environment, by culture, and by time period, but the solutions your ancestors found were more sophisticated than most people assume. Burial is the one most people know, and it is genuinely ancient. The site of Kafsa Cave in Israel contains deliberate human burials dating back around 100,000 years. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal burial was discovered with traces of pollen clustered around the skeleton, suggesting, though it remains debated among archaeologists, that flowers may have been placed with the dead. Whether or not the flowers were intentional, the burial itself was. These were not bodies left to decompose where they fell. They were placed, positioned, often in a fetal curl, knees drawn toward the chest, the same position a sleeping body finds naturally, the same shape a newborn holds. Some researchers believe this posture was symbolic, a return to the beginning. Others simply note that a flexed burial takes less space and less effort to dig. It may have been both. In the ancient world, the practical and the sacred were rarely separate. In environments where digging was impossible, frozen ground, rocky terrain, other solutions emerged. Exposure burial. Placing a body on a raised platform or in a tree to decompose and return to the sky was practiced across multiple cultures on multiple continents. Independently, sky burial persists today in Tibet. Water burial, releasing a body to a river or the sea, appears in the archaeological record of coastal populations. Cremation, burning the body to ash, dates back at least 20,000 years in the archaeological record, with one of the earliest confirmed examples found at Lake Mungo in Australia. The specific method mattered less than the intention behind. Across all of these practices, the common thread is this: the dead were not ignored. They were handled with deliberateness. They were given a place to go. But the burial was not the end of the process, not even close. After the body was placed, the community gathered. And what happened next was something modern humans have largely lost. Something researchers now believe was one of the most psychologically important technologies your ancestors ever developed. They told stories. Polly Wiesner, an anthropologist at the University of Utah, conducted a landmark study comparing daytime and nighttime conversation among the Ju-Hoanzi people. During the day, conversation was practical: logistics, resources, conflict, complaint. But at night, around the fire, 81% of conversation shifted to something else entirely: narrative. Stories about people, about events, about things that had happened, about what someone said or did or meant. Death, in these communities, triggered an intensification of exactly this. The person who had died became the subject of storytelling. Not to idealize them, your ancestors were too pragmatic for hollow praise, but to place them in context. To remember the time she found water when no one else could. To recall the argument he had with the neighboring band and how it ended. To laugh at the thing that was funny and cry at the thing that hurt. This is what grief rituals actually do. Not just for the person who died, but for the community that remains. Psychological research on narrative grief, the practice of constructing a coherent story about a loss, shows that people who are able to integrate a death into a meaningful, personal, and communal narrative recover their functioning faster and report lower rates of complicated grief than those who cannot. Your ancestors discovered this without a psychology department. They built it into the structure of how they spent their evenings. The mourning period in most documented hunter-gatherer societies lasted a significant stretch of time, sometimes weeks. The Andaman Islanders, studied by Alfred Radcliffe Brown in the early 20th century, observed mourning periods that involved daily crying sessions for months. This was not considered abnormal. It was considered necessary. The social group would not function well if grief was suppressed or rushed. The pressure to grieve, to actually do it, with your body, with your voice, with your community, was a survival technology. And then, gradually, life resumed, but the dead did not entirely leave. In many ancient cultures, the deceased continued to have a presence in daily life. Objects that had belonged to them were kept or ritually destroyed, depending on the tradition. Among some cultures, personal names of the deceased were avoided for a time, the word itself too painful, or the name felt to carry something of the person that should not be carelessly invoked. In others, the dead were spoken to directly, told about the hunt, asked for guidance, included in the decision-making of the living. This is not delusion. It is relationship maintenance with someone who is no longer physically present. But who remains psychologically real? Research on continuing bonds, a theory developed by grief psychologists Klass, Silverman, and Nickman in the 1990s, found that maintaining an ongoing internal relationship with the deceased is not pathological. In most cases, it is associated with better long-term adjustment. Your ancestors were right. You do not have to let go. You have to learn to. So here is the thing. The modern death industry, the funeral home, the embalmed body in a sealed casket, the 48 hours between death and burial, the single service, the uncomfortable handshakes, the pressure to be composed, is historically an anomaly. It is roughly a century old in its current form. Before that, even in Western cultures, The dead were kept at home. Family members washed the body. People sat with it. Children were not shielded from it. Death was in the house, in the room, in the smell of the candles lit to mask what decomposition begins to do within hours. Your ancestors handled this with more tools than you might expect. Not technological tools, emotional ones, communal ones, ritualized. They wailed. They prepared the body themselves. They buried it with meaning. They told stories. They mourned for as long as it took. They let the dead continue to exist in some form in the daily conversation of the living. You inherited all of this. Every funeral that makes you cry without knowing exactly why. Every impulse to tell a story about someone who is gone. Every refusal to clean out a closet or throw away a voicemail. That is not weakness. That is 300,000 years of knowing exactly what grief demands. You wake up the morning after someone you love is gone, and the world is still there. The fire is still burning. The camp is still around you, and your ancestors already knew what to do.